Well, good morning, everyone. We are really pleased to see you this morning for JPAC's second town hall. For those of you who attended last time, we welcome you back. And for those of you who are new, we are happy to have you join us this morning. JPAC is proud to be the voice of California's Jewish community to the state capitol, raising awareness about issues that directly support the Jewish community and further Jewish values. This year, we celebrated our 50th annual Advocacy Conference in Sacramento, with our biggest turnout ever as California's organized Jewish communities convener. We were proud to network with key legislators and community leaders to address today's crucial issues through a Jewish lens, using our community's collective reach and strength to help build the world we want to live in for ourselves and for all of our communities across California. I'm proud of the multitude of successes in our legislative agenda this year. These successes exemplify how our legislators and our governor recognize the social justice imperatives of Judaism while rooting out the evils of anti-Semitism and hate. We're grateful for our long-standing partnerships and alliances that we have created to achieve our collective goals. Right now, I'm pleased to introduce to you Executive Director David Bocarsly and Cliff Berg, our legislative advocate. They will be discussing this year's bill process, JPAC's legislative agenda process, and our bill updates. Please use the Q&A function on your screen to propose questions during the presentation, which Cliff and David will address either in their discussion or in a formal Q&A period afterwards. Again, thank you all for being here, and I wish you all a meaningful holiday tomorrow evening.
Well, thanks so much, Allison. You have, first of all, I'll just start off by saying you have been such an incredible chair for JPAC, expertly guiding us through two very challenging years for our state and a major leadership transition for us. And I know since this might be one of the major times we have to present publicly, although your term as chair is coming to a close at the end of this year, I just want to say we're so grateful that you'll remain involved on our board and by leading our Advocacy Day committee for next year. And I also want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. It has been a busy year on the advocacy front, but as of Friday, any bills from 2021 or 2022 were officially signed or vetoed. So we're done with this 2-year legislative cycle. And we're excited to tell you today how a bill goes from introduction through the legislative process and passed into a law impacting California's 40 million residents. We'll tell you about JPAC's priorities as well, our process and impact on our key legislation. But before we jump in, I want to make one quick plug. This is our second, as Allison said, our second ever town hall that we've done like this. And our first was in July after the budget was passed. This year, we secured a record $141.2 million from the state budget for a variety of Jewish community priorities. And today we're going to be talking about bills, which create California law. But if you want to learn about how the state doles out its $300 billion budget every single year, and which items we helped fund, you can watch our July town hall on our YouTube channel, and I will post the link in the chat now for you all to be able to access. So with that, we're gonna talk about bills, and I'll turn to Cliff, our lobbyist extraordinaire. Cliff is my amazing partner in crime, helping us to navigate a very complicated legislative process. And Cliff and I are going to have what we hope will be a free-flowing conversation about this wonky process. We know that many of you submitted questions in advance, and we will do our best to weave many of those questions into the conversation. But if things come up in the discussion, as Allison said, please use the Q&A function. We'll plan to create space to answer questions that don't come up in the discussion near the end of the hour, but we'll also try to weave them in throughout. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Cliff. Why don't
Thank you.
Yeah, so why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about the legislative process? Take us from a bill being dreamed of and introduced, and tell us what its journey is through the legislative process to becoming law.
Thank you, David. And before I do that, I want to echo your comments about Allison. Allison, thank you so much for all the tremendous work you've done as chair of JPAC. As chair of JPAC, she has led many of our efforts on legislation and issues of concern, and then necessarily stepping in when our executive director left and taking on the job of executive director. So fantastic job. And of course, David now is our full-time executive director and is my partner in working on all of these, whether it's legislation or budget issues, doing a tremendous job in behalf of JPAC and our member organizations. So the bill process in the California legislature, you got to start somewhere with the bill. So where does it start? It generally starts as an idea of what we call a sponsor, but it also can be the idea of a member of the legislature or their staff. So we have what are called sponsored bills in California, and the sponsor could be an organization like JPAC. It could be an individual member of the community. Many members of the legislature actually have town halls to allow constituents to come in and give them bill ideas, and then they introduce bills. Members of the legislature have different philosophies. We have a few members of the legislature who will basically not carry a sponsored bill because they feel that it's their name on the bill and that they will only author a bill that they have total control over. At the same time, certain organizations wouldn't go to that certain members because they want to make sure that as a sponsoring organization, they have control over, or at least a veto over any changes to the bill. So there's an interesting relationship right at the start. And how do you pick an author and how do you find an author and what are the rules of the road going to be in terms of the relationship between the sponsor and the author over what happens when, like in Jesse Gabriel's 587, technology comes up and says, we want all these amendments. Is that Jesse's decision, ADL's decision, or most often a partnership? But you want to feel comfortable as a sponsor that you have an author who's not going to turn your bill into something that you would not like. That's always pretty embarrassing. So a bill is introduced. So right now the legislature is adjourned. They're adjourned sine die, which means that they are constitutionally gone and cannot return, which means no bills can be introduced. They convene December 5th. It will be a new legislature on December 5th. It will be a legislature sworn in that day based upon the members selected in the November election, which means 80 members of the assembly will all be sworn in. They have 2-year terms. They're up every election cycle. Half the Senate's 40 members, 20 members every 2 years sworn in. Those members will be sworn in, and then bang, the gavel is fallen. They elect leadership, and they also start bill introduction. So as I mentioned, depending on whether it's a sponsor or authored bill, the bill has to go through the same process, and that means it goes to legislative counsel, which is the legislator's lawyer. No matter what the sponsor or the author write in a bill, it has to go to legislative counsel. When it goes to legislative counsel, frankly, it could be nothing more than a one-sentence idea also, and legislative counsel is the legislature's lawyer. They, couple of hundred, maybe even more lawyers based on various codes, they will take your idea or your draft, turn it into and approve, and they have to approve the bill before it can ever be introduced. It has to be in their format. Up until very recently, I don't know whether it's changed due to COVID, but a bill was a physical object, like literally a piece of paper like this with the member's name then being checked. There's what's called a jacket, which had all the members' names on it, all the 80 members and 40 members, and you would sign, and the member would have to initial by their name. Their staff would take it down to the desk in the house of origin, and they would stamp it with a number, and that's how you got your bill number. Can't tell you whether it's any way changed due to digitalization, but that's basically how a bill gets introduced. So once a bill is introduced and physically introduced, it gets a number. California is different than Congress in one important aspect. So in Congress, you see a lot of bills that are omnibus bills, committee bills. California, we favor bills by author name. So Ben Allen is the author of the bill. He can have co-authors, but unless you have a lead author, you don't have a bill. You have to have an author, you have to have a bill prepared by legislative counsel. They have to put it across the desk with their name and initials. You've got a bill. It's then subject to a legislative process that I call David.
Really quickly,
Yes.
it's great. So you mentioned that every bill needs to have its author, right? So can you say
Yep.
something about authors can introduce a certain number of bills every cycle and what those limits are? And
Well, authors can introduce a certain number of bills every cycle. It's varied. At various times, the legislature has imposed what they call bill limits in order to try to move the process along, reform the process by not having certain members introduce 500 bills. So, those limits have changed over the years. During COVID, the limits were dropped way down, and members were in essence told, you can only get 5 bills to pass the House or 10 bills because we have a more limited capacity. So clearly, COVID impacted the entire legislative process in ways that I intend to talk about. So once the bill's introduced, the process in my mind, and I describe it as very linear. It's like it's got to move through a linear process through policy committee, fiscal committee, to the floor, and then it goes to the other house and it repeats the same process in the other house. All of that process is governed by what we call deadlines. So there's like a limited time period to get a request to legislative council. There's an actual deadline. If you don't get your request to legislative council by let's say January 24th, you don't get a bill and you can't introduce it. You can't get around that deadline. The legislative council can just say, sorry, too late. You have a deadline to introduce bills, sort of end of February. You have then a deadline to move it out of policy committee sometime in April, a deadline to move it out of fiscal committee sometime in May, a deadline to pass the House of Origin sometime in June, and then repeat all that process and get it all done by the end of August or by the second week of September, and then it goes to the governor. Along the way, obviously, lots of opportunities for the bill to get held in policy committee. One of the big roadblocks that we often talk about is what we call the Appropriations Committee suspense file. Appropriations Committee suspense file works. It's a leadership device created by leadership to, in essence, give them the ability to hold bills, which is it's a difficult thing for a Democratic leader to hold a member of their caucus's bills without a good reason. So the reason that they've created these bottlenecks in the Senate Appropriations and Assembly Appropriations Committee called suspense file, which basically means any bill with a fiscal cost over 50,000 in one house, I think it's 150 in the other house, goes to the suspense file. It's not voted on, held in the suspense file till weeks till we approach the deadline. You approach the deadline, the chair of appropriations meets with his staff in the leadership office, pro tem or speaker's office. They go through all the lists. They ask each member to tell them which are your three most important bills. And then they make a decision behind back doors, which bills are going to pass. And then they have a hearing in which there's no testimony. The author is not present, and they just read the bills they're going to pass. And those bills pass. And if your bill's not read, it's held in committee, and that's it. And there's no way of getting around it, generally speaking, because it's what we call a jailbreak, very frowned on. Bill will be referred back to committee.
So just at this point, Cliff, I just want to
Yep.
kind of rehash everything that you said, since you've given us so much detail. But it sounds what you've taken us through is once a bill is introduced, it has to go through one or more various policy committees in the House that it's introduced in. Then it goes to the Appropriations, which is this committee that you talked about, that is kind of this black box, an opportunity to reassess and kill bills in a really opaque way. And that's a way to determine whether it's technically a way to determine whether a bill is affordable for the state to keep moving, right? And then it goes to the floor of that house, and then it has to repeat itself doing the exact same thing in the other house, right? That's where we are in your process so far.
Exactly. And then it's got to go to the governor, and then the governor has like 30 days to sign, veto, or let it become law without signature. Interesting note, the governor this year's deadline to pass or to sign, veto, or let bills become law without a signature was last Friday. So he had like literally 900 bills sent to him in August for a total of around 1,200 bills for the year. He vetoed like 14.5% of the bills, and most of the bills that he vetoed contained a very standard message, which basically comes down to, I'm worried about the state budget, I'm worried about the economy, and this bill either spends money that was not in the budget or not budgeted, or expands a program that was not contemplated in the budget. So I'm vetoing it. So he's sending a very strong message at this point regarding concern about where the state will be on the overall budget. So not very often that this governor has ever allowed a bill to become law without a signature. He's either vetoed it or signed it. So just to sort of wrap up before I toss it back to you, David, to talk about some of how JPAC sets its priorities on these bills we're talking about. There's some general tensions within the system between what I would call the public's right to know and the desire to be effective and efficient. So we've seen a couple of things happen over the years, one of which is limitations on the ability to amend bills in the process. So, the notion of what we call in Sacramento a gut and amend was pretty rampant here 10 years ago, which is people would wait to the end of session and their strategy would be find another bill, amend it, which we call the gut, take out what was in there and amend to put in a entirely different bill and circumvent the policy committee process.
And this goes back to your process that you laid out earlier, which is there were very rigorous deadlines, right? A bill has to be introduced to legislative council in January and introduced to the legislature by February. Otherwise, that's it. So some things might come up throughout the year that are urgent, they need to be acted on, but they need to use a bill that was already pre-introduced. So that's one way of when it got
or introduce what we call an urgency bill, which an urgency bill in legislative parlance, an urgency bill is a bill that could be introduced after the deadline, but requires a 2/3 vote and takes effect immediately. Right. So, the ways of dealing with crises are either through introduction of urgency bills or the governor calling a special session, which waives a lot of the deadlines and the rules. So remember, a lot of the deadlines, again, are put there to prevent people from sneaking things through the legislature and pulling a fast one. There's a gut and amend, and a lot of the rules that we have. So when a bill is introduced, it has to be in print for what we call 30 days. The 30-day in print rules is out there so that the world has an opportunity to review the legislation, discuss it with your organization and your clients so that you and I can bring it to JPAC and we have time to review it. 30-day in print rule. Also 4-day in file notice rule means in essence, you can't set a bill policy committee without a certain amount of public notice of the hearing. And then they enacted the 72-hour in print rule to deal with the gut and amends at end of session, which means you can't take up a bill on the floor if it's been amended within 72 hours. So you have to wait 72 hours, which means people have to sort of then strategize 72 hours from when backwards. Do I want to make sure I get my amendments, which then creates new deadlines for Leg Council to say, if you don't get your amendments into Leg Council by such and such a date, you're not going to get them back. And I can tell you people were scurrying all over the Capitol at the very end in August to make sure they just got their stuff to Leg Council to get the amendment back in time to amend it on the floor so that it can sit there for 72 hours. So David, do you want to talk a bit about the JPAC process and how JPAC then intersects with the legislative process?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that really expansive and helpful overview. As you can see, it's a pretty wonky process. But if you understand it and you know where those deadlines are and you figure out how power is built, you can really help make an impact in getting a bill across the finish line. So I'll share a little bit about how we do that. I'll start by saying this. A few years ago, we at JPAC put together a policy framework that outlines the different issue areas that we work on. It's on our website, and I'll let you look at it if you're interested. And it generally covers issues that our member organizations focus on. It's pretty robust and diverse, but I like to say that the work that we do really falls in two pillars. First is we fight for core Jewish community issues like combating anti-Semitism and hate and expanding Holocaust and genocide education. And we fight for core Jewish community values like serving seniors and immigrants and fighting hunger and poverty and domestic violence. And if we have a specific policy idea that falls within that framework, we'll identify legislators who are most strategic to champion a particular bill. We will meet with them usually around this time of year or early in the new year, and also with their staff, and ask them to introduce it and work with them on language and advocacy strategy. As other bills are introduced,
David, I think you're making a really important point, which is when I talked about sponsors and authors getting in earlier the prior year, really important. So you really have to start the process early.
Exactly. And we're starting, Cliff and I are starting to strategize that, and we're already taking meetings with some members to think about who would want to champion some of our ideas for next year. So that's absolutely right. And in addition to the bills that we're going to propose to the legislature, we'll also support a slate of bills that other coalitions bring to the legislature. And so as bills are introduced in the first few months of the year, Cliff and I are tracking each new bill and identifying whether it might fall under our policy framework. And that narrows the universe of bills that we can support from about 2,000 or 3,000, which are introduced every single year, to a few hundred, which is still way too many for us to actually get involved in. But once we've narrowed it down to a few hundred bills, we'll start a dialogue with our member organizations about what bills they're particularly interested in. We'll also go to coalition partners in each of our priority issue areas and identify their most consequential bills. And then we'll hear from many of you about the bills that you're interested in. And through these conversations, I'll start putting together a list of bills that are going to be most relevant to our work and make the biggest impact in the community. And importantly, we're also looking to identify bills where our involvement can actually make a difference between whether it passes or not. There are many bills that might sail through because they're widely supported, and we want to choose strategic bills where we know that we are actually going to be a difference maker. We'll also strategically select a subset of these bills that represent a cross-section of our work to highlight Advocacy Day in May. So, for example, this year we ended up supporting about 28 bills in total, and our Advocacy Day bills were about 7, because that was a way that we can strategically bring them to the legislature, show the legislature what we most care about, or the issues that we most care about, and build momentum for not just those bills, but all of them. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So once we've got this recommended package, I have a lot of conversations with our board, and we finalize a diverse set of bills that ends up serving as our priority bills for California's Jewish community that year. And I'll just say, I think that this annual package demonstrates the uniqueness of our organization. We represent a vastly diverse Jewish coalition, and our member organizations realize that even if they don't work on every issue in our priority list, that by working together and strategically putting forward one cohesive Jewish policy agenda, it will ensure that everyone's issues are considered. It's this idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, and we do that really well at JPAC, and I'm really proud of that. But anyway, so now we have a bill package. And so the question now becomes, as we look at Cliff's timeline of how a bill becomes a law, what do we do to ensure that these bills pass through all the hurdles that Cliff describes and actually get signed into law? So first, what we'll do is we'll write support letters for each bill to the author. This publicly indicates that we support a given bill and gives the author permission to add JPAC's name to their list of supporters. Our name will then be displayed on the bill's fact sheets and on committee reports, and so every legislator sees it before they vote. We'll also write support letters to every committee that every bill goes to, which will be sent to every member of that committee before their vote. So you're seeing we're getting a lot of recognition in front of these legislatures that this is something that the Jewish community cares about. These letters also make a compelling argument for why this particular bill is important and why it's relevant to our community. Cliff will then help us set up meetings for our staff and our leaders of our member organizations to meet with key legislators who might chair a committee that a bill is going to, or perhaps be a deciding vote on the floor. And then we'll work with coalition partners on public pressure campaigns as needed. If there's a bill that needs a lot of support in a given moment, we'll put out action alerts where we'll ask all of you to write or call a specific legislator or group of legislators that might make a difference. We may orchestrate social media pressure campaigns or pitch articles that will help move legislators. All of these things will collectively help show that support for a particular bill is important. And I'll say, what we decide to do and when we do it is very much an art, not necessarily a science. But Cliff, I know you've been doing this work in the legislature for decades, and I worked in the legislature for the last 5 years. And I think between the two of us, we have we'll have regular strategy conversations, and we're able to use our knowledge of how power is held in Sacramento to strategically focus on the most influential legislators at any given time in this process and maximize our impact.
Yeah, I mean, totally right on, David. I mean, it's a reality that certain legislators or certain offices have, let's say, a disproportionate influence on the process, whether it's the committee chair's office, the consultants to the appropriations committee, the speaker's office, the pro tem's office. So not all are created equal in Sacramento.
Right.
And then, of course, there's a partisan, makeup and nature of the committees. And in Sacramento today, Democrats are certainly in charge. So David, brings his expertise in working for Senate Democrats, and the expertise that we have together to figure out what is the right path, and what is the best use of our time, because time is always very limited, and legislators' attention spans are limited, and their ability to get access to them is one of the most important things that David and I do in terms of pinpointing those people who are going to make the decisions on the outcome.
Right. And you said something really important. Power is not held equally, but I would add power is not held equally at any given moment in the process too, right? It's constantly shifting depending on where a bill is.
Absolutely. Where you are in so, each little committee may have, or does have certainly different potential players than the committee in the other house, the fiscal committee versus the policy committee, the floor and the caucuses. So it's a very complex system in Sacramento.
Yeah, exactly.
With multiple opportunities for things to go wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So now also I want to say a word about Advocacy Day. We specifically set up Advocacy Day to happen during the heart of the legislature's first committee hearings. As Cliff mentioned, there were these kind of 6 steps: committee hearings, fiscal committee, floor, and then you go to the other house: committee hearings, fiscal committee, floor. We set up our Advocacy Day right at the first committee hearings, so that we can make sure that we put our stamp on bills and make our strongest push at the most consequential moment. And while we push for a few key priority bills to talk about at Advocacy Day, more importantly, we're power building in that moment. When we show up with hundreds of engaged community leaders to the Capitol, we're sending a message to legislators that they should pay attention to what we're asking for. So while we will focus on a few strategic items that day, we're also building momentum for all of our asks later on in the process. And when Advocacy Day is over, we continue to advocate for our bills at each step in the legislative process using the various methods I just described. And at every touch point after Advocacy Day, we're able to point back to the power of our community that these legislators saw in Sacramento in May. And so, of course, when our bills make it through all of the policy committees, the fiscal committees in both houses, as you mentioned, Cliff, we move our attention to the governor, who also were pushing at Advocacy Day. So as Cliff mentioned, most of the bills he sees are decided in September, around that time every single year. We just finished that month. And so at the point when all the bills have been moved over to the governor's office, we will set up meetings with his key policy staffers who work on our priority bills. And we'll continue the same pressure tactics that we use for legislators, writing letters, coordinating action.
David?
Yep.
Yeah, I do think, all of that is absolutely correct. But I do think, one of the things that you and I have worked on successfully with JPAC and with our partner organizations and all of you who are on the call, who are part of those organizations, was the ability to get in early on our issues and lay the groundwork in the governor's office, not waiting till September, but going in on lobby day, going in on mini missions and talking so that it's not a new issue to the decision makers in September. And I think that's one of the things that JPAC has excelled at through its, the commitment of our member organizations, their participation in JPAC to get these issues on people's radar earlier in the year.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Thanks, Cliff. And so that's really a quick overview, but a wide breadth of how we get involved, both in the moment of urgency, but also throughout the year to build momentum. So maybe we can take this opportunity to shift and talk about specific priority bills that we just worked on this year. Cliff, I mentioned earlier that our work generally falls into two pillars, right? Core Jewish community issues and core Jewish community values. And so let's start with issues. This year's Jewish issues package was based on really combating the lifespan of hate. We set a goal of addressing hate across its lifespan, from where it's learned, how it's spread, acted on, and then ultimately responded to. Do you want to talk about some of the major anti-hate bills that fall in that lifespan that we worked on this year, maybe how they fit into this lifespan model and how successful we were?
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had a couple of issues that certainly or maybe all of them, that were really multi-year issues for JPAC, at least, and for the authors and some of the organizations that were behind them. And in some ways, they also show a really good example. I'm going to pick on AB 587 Gabriel as a really good example of how JPAC was able to really elevate an issue and work it all through the year, and play a major role in the outcome. So 587 was Assemblyman Gabriel's legislation to try to have a California response to the issues that are troubling us nationally and internationally about online hate. And clearly we're seeing how online hate, it can be both just vile, offensive, but also motivate people to take action, and how online technology is being used by radical groups, white supremacists, others, to push their agenda both ideologically and physically. So as a result, Jesse and ADL came up with, and ADL was the actual sponsor of this bill, but asked JPAC early on to be of assistance, to at least post the rules of the road, the terms of service on using content, online hate content, and how social media platforms establish those rules and what those rules were. Needless to say, unlike most hate bills that we deal with, when we, like Rebecca Bauer-Can had a bill limiting the use of offensive swastikas and things like that, generally people don't show up and oppose those bills and say, hey, I want to preserve my right to post swastikas. I mean, the perpetrators generally want to hide in the weeds, and they don't show up in committee hearings in the legislature and run lobbying campaigns to oppose. In the case of Jesse's bill, there was substantial opposition, and it wasn't by people who were going to say, hey, we're in favor of hate, but they raised constitutional issues about free speech, about how those companies are the economic drivers of the California economy, and the state depends upon them to generate jobs and state revenues and to fund all the social services programs that we care deeply about, and that unreasonable burdens on these social media platforms would hinder their ability to drive the California economy. And then there's another constituency of organizations that were very much like, this is a free speech issue. You can't do X, Y, or Z because it's a constitutional issue. So Jesse's bill was introduced last year, 2021, passed the Assembly, got to the Senate Judiciary Committee. The chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee asked him to hold it, make it a 2-year bill, held an interim hearing on the constitutional issues surrounding his bill. And there's like at least 4 or maybe 5 other bills with other authors that were trying to deal with this online hate problem in different ways, one of which was going to create a right to sue. So, JPAC stepped in, worked closely with ADL and ADL's lobbyists in terms of lobbying the committee members, testifying in committee, setting up meetings with the committee chair, lobbying the governor's office. Ultimately, the bill was let out of the suspense file. I think, a critical factor there was the way in which JPAC worked with a coalition of communities and showed broad support to the chair. It was probably a pivotal meeting in ensuring that it passed the suspense file because the issue was in doubt. And then ultimately the governor signed with a big press to do to show his leadership with a number of other bills on hate. So, I think that's a great example. It was part of our lobbying day. Right. We worked it all year for 2 years, and was a major success for the Assembly member, for ADL, and for JPAC in getting that bill signed into law.
And if I can just make one comment about what you were saying, which I think is really important. You brought up how, no one's going to come out and say, I support the swastika, right? The use of the swastika is generally from interest groups generally opposed, right? But a lot of questions actually that came up in ahead of this town hall were around who's opposed to Jewish issues. Like, what are we actually going to do? Like, who are we fighting against? And it's a really good question, because I don't think there is an anti-Jewish group, but on any given issue, there might be particular interest groups that are impacted by, one way or another. So you gave a great example of a bill where, social media companies and tech companies weren't opposed to it, and some broader free speech organizations were skeptical. And I think that's important to remember across the board. We're not always fighting against anyone in particular, but on a given bill, there might be specific opposition based on what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, I think, you're absolutely correct. And as I said, on like Rebecca Bauer-Kahan's bill, on the swastika and other, symbols of hatred, it's always possible, like, some white supremacist group's going to find out about it, show up in the Capitol steps and protest, but not likely they're going to show up in a legislative committee hearing. But Jesse's bills, certainly the technology community was out in full force, and they enlisted the State Chamber of Commerce. It was a priority bill for the State Chamber of Commerce, for TechNet, for the various trade associations representing the industry in the Silicon Valley that all the major social media companies are part of. I think you're right. It's interesting. Is an organization going to show up and say we're against this because the Jewish community isn't supportive of it? No, but not likely. But we have had situations where other organizations have shown up and claim to represent the Jewish community. A prime example being Jewish Voice for Peace, right? When Richard Bloom did his bill and JPAC supported to try to restrict the ability of BDS to get state government or private business to participate in a boycott of Israel and/or Israel-related organizations. You had organizations show up in Sacramento and work the hallways that were misled. So, an interesting challenge for JPAC on the long term is sometimes it's not a clear, and members of the legislature and their staffs can get confused as to who's a legitimate Jewish organization and who is not. And then these organizations try to create a perception that the Jewish community is not united behind a particular issue, but is divided. So that can be a challenge. I wanted to mention, just to update people, 693 by Stern is another bill that JPAC supported from last year, would have set up a Holocaust Education Council to further our schools' programs or lack of programs to educate. That bill got held in committee last year because the governor's office had specific ideas about how they wanted to do it. The good news was the governor announced last fall, around this time in October, the creation of the council by executive order, which made the bill perhaps last year not necessary. We thought maybe this year it was still on our list because we thought maybe we would need the bill for funding, but the governor put the funding in the state budget. So that's a bill that was on our list, right. But we accomplished our goals through both the budget process and leadership in the governor's office and taking leadership with an executive order. So sometimes we see ideas that are put in bill form, they're introduced as a bill, but the issue gets solved in different ways. Right. And I know that's probably a good segue, David, to you talking about some of the social services bills and about how, while some of them were signed, some of them were not signed because they got held in suspense file, but the governor put the money in the state budget. And what we've seen just from a historic standpoint, a strategy standpoint, is less and less bills being moved along with appropriations in them, with this governor and prior governors and the legislature more and more favoring the notion of we're not going to allow piecemeal bills setting up programs with money in them. We're going to fold them into the state budget. David, do you want to talk about some of the JPAC social service stuff?
No, yeah, it's a great transition, and just a good point that you made at the end, which was bills can become law, and that's great. But bills also serve other purpose. They serve as a mechanism to try to implement the heart of that bill in other ways. And so, with SB 693, Henry Stern's bill, we were able to get that implemented in a very meaningful way, even though the bill wasn't signed into law. So when we say we've gotten X bills signed into law, that's not always a clear indication of how successful we were. there's a lot of different impacts that can happen from support of a bill. So to your question, you talked a little bit about the Jewish issues bills, the anti-hate package that we worked on this year. You mentioned the spread, how we help to combat the spread of hate through social media accountability. You talked about the Holocaust and Genocide Education Council, which will help people learn about the impact of unchecked bigotry. So we're talking about learning, we're talking about the spread. And then I just want to add one more piece that you didn't mention yet, which was AB 1664, another Assemblymember Gabriel bill, which helps expand our security grant program. So now that's how do we protect ourselves as a community when hate has already been festered. So we're really kind of focusing on the spread of hate and how to different points in the process.
Thanks for bringing that one up. And I think that's another good example, though, also of the multifaceted approach of JPAC's broad tackling of these issues in the legislative process. How we needed that bill to extend the sunset date on the program and to provide legal authorization of the use of money, but at the same time, JPAC supported the state budget ask, and the Jewish caucus supported and led with JPAC a budget ask that got put in the May revise for $50 million to fund the program. And then we had the question, and originally went back to the original one of the earlier years that JPAC led the effort with the Jewish caucus to get some money for the nonprofit security grants, that we create a statutory framework for the program. One of the ideas behind it was, if it's in statute, maybe we won't have to go back and ask the governor every year for money. As it turned out, the governor figured that out, and he insisted on a sunset date on Jesse's bill the first time, and we still had to go back, and the Jewish caucus still had to go back and ask for the money. But anyway, this certainly it gives you an advantage in the budget discussion when you're asking for money if there's a statute on the books.
The state has said clearly, we codify this program. This is a program we support. And so, that bill was instrumental in extending that program. And definitely, even though we will continue to go back and ask for money. Anyways, I'm gonna move over to your actual question, which was, what are the Jewish values bills that we've worked on this year? And I'll try to run through some of them really quickly. This year, we supported 3 major bills that would extend critical services. By that, I mean healthcare, nutrition, and unemployment benefits to people in need, regardless of immigration status. That was a big focus for us. On nutrition benefits, there was a bill called Food for All that was championed by Senator Hurtado. That was actually included, as you mentioned, in the state budget earlier this year. So the bill didn't need to move forward. So we supported the bill. It was implemented in the budget. The governor said we're going to give money to this project. No need for the bill. So that was a victory earlier this year. Health for All, which was championed by Assemblymember Arambula and Senator Durazo, was partially included in the budget. We wanted health benefits to go to all people, regardless of immigration status. It was ultimately allocated for immigrants over 55 and under 26. But so there's still this missing middle that advocates are looking to fund in full in coming years. And then the third one in that category is Safety Net for All, which would extend unemployment benefits. And that made it all the way through the legislature with bipartisan support, but was ultimately vetoed by the governor due to budgetary concerns, which you mentioned, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. We also had some really good victories in the anti-poverty bill space this year. Senator Skinner's bill that provides trust fund accounts for low-income children who have lost parents to COVID, and also for children who have experienced long-term foster care was included in the budget. And so too was Senator Rubio's bill that allows some of our poorest families who were previously ineligible for the young child tax credit to access that credit. And finally, in that category, a bill by Assemblymember Wicks to allow faith institutions to convert parking requirements into affordable housing was signed into law. So I just named 5 bills that were really important to us. One of those was signed into law, and 4 of those were incorporated into the budget, interestingly enough. We did have a major victory in the anti-hunger department on Friday, on the last day to decide on bills. We saw Governor Newsom sign another bill by Senator Skinner that removes barriers for college students seeking CalFresh food assistance. So that will significantly reduce college hunger. And then we had 2 key domestic violence bills signed into law as well. One from Assembly Majority Leader Reyes and one from Senator Rubio that add domestic violence survivors to the list of vulnerable populations that can access various state resources. And the last thing I'll mention quickly is SCA 2, Senate Constitutional Amendment that was authored by Senator Allen, which would, I should say, remove a racist housing segregation relic from our state's constitution. And I say would because it's a constitutional amendment. So it's not actually signed into law. Its process to actually passing is it has to be voted on by 2/3 of the legislature, which it was in a bipartisan way. And then it has to be voted on by the people at the ballot. So we got that through the legislature this year, and we'll see that on our 2024 ballot. So in summary, including the bills that Cliff named and the bills that I named, we had 8 bills signed into law this year. I think 6 were included in the budget in some way, and one of them is on the 2024 ballot. So that's 15 bills of impact, which is pretty good. And you know what? I will actually, while I'm at it,
Amazing. Yeah, amazing year for JPAC, both when you have those bills together and all the budget items we talked about in the last webinar. Just quite amazing, and couldn't be done without all of our organizations weighing in behalf of these issues and budget items.
That's absolutely true. And Cliff, I just, and for everybody here, I just posted in the chat a link to that shows the outcome of many of our bill and budget items for this year. So feel free to check that out. So I'll pass it back to you, Cliff. You know, I mentioned earlier, and you kind of talked about this too, but we had a bill to expand unemployment benefits, and it was ultimately vetoed by the governor. And we had others vetoed this year as well for similar budgetary concerns. One was about it would have limited family fees for childcare for low-income families, and another would have provided grants to high schools to create student wellness centers to address mental health. So we saw 3 of our own bills actually die in the last couple of weeks because of future budgetary concerns. So maybe, well, you know, I would just say maybe we saw this, we can dive into this for one minute. We saw this theme generally, as you said, at the end of the legislative cycle, where dozens of bills were vetoed with the same general statement. With our state facing lower than expected revenues over the first few months of this fiscal year, says the governor, it's important to remain disciplined when it comes to spending, particularly spending that is ongoing. We saw that in the veto message of so many different bills. It's just an indication of kind of what you already talked about. We had a $93 billion surplus this year, and that's because our state is largely dependent on capital gains revenue and income taxes from our wealthiest Californians. And we had a really good year last year from an economic standpoint, and we haven't had such a great year this year. So early economic forecasts suggest that next year's budget surplus may not exist or may not be as big. And so the governor was being particularly wary, and we actually saw a record number of bills vetoed this year as a result. So we don't know, I don't know if you want to say something else about this. We don't know what next year will look like, but it's important to remember that every year is different. And our budgetary cycle and our bill cycle is totally different. And the governor has said, as you kind of alluded to, the governor has set a priority that if we are going to address budget, we're going to do so through the budget process. If there are bills that are going to create massive expenditures for the states, we should add it to the budget rather than wait till later in the year and add it on. We might not have the money. That's kind of the governor's message. I don't necessarily love it that a bunch of our big bills were vetoed, but it's an interesting lesson to be thinking about. Yeah,
I think absolutely. In essence, the governor is sending a clear signal through his bill vetoes that, we need to be conservative as a state and rein in spending. And also, I think is also a signal that, approaching next year, JPAC once again needs to, as we set our priorities, try to get the administration on board as early as possible. I mean, this is a governor that drives a lot of spending for programs that, in essence, this administration thinks of. So when we talk about the bill process and the budget process, I think you have to factor in each governor is very different and each administration is very different. And this governor has not been shy about saying, it was just like 2 months ago that he said, I want to take $10 billion and give it back to motorists in California for driving cars with during high gas price due to high gas prices. Now, the governor also last week just announced that he wants to see the legislature approve what he calls a windfall profits tax on oil companies. And this governor has very much been willing to take all those new revenues that when we had the budget surplus last year and or new revenue sources and allocate them to programs that he thinks are going to be important or his priorities. So we saw him in the last budget cycle take $10 billion, put it back, give it back to motorists. I think these checks are starting to go out, or ACHs are going out in October. He put many hundreds of millions of dollars into women's reproductive rights, which was a fairly new issue that emerged after the Roe v. Wade decision, but he jumped on it and immediately diverted hundreds of millions into that category. He's pushed climate change, carbon emission reduction as huge priorities and allocating billions and billions of dollars into that basket. So, one of the things to do is to look at the tea leaves. Where are they going to put money next year? What are the big issues going to be next year? Certainly, we know climate change is not going to be solved overnight. Wildfires, natural disasters, drought, signed a big package of bills related to drought-related and water issues just a few days ago, end of last week. Student loans, and student debt remain a big issue and the governor's radar, and two of the packages that he announced last week. So we know certain issues are going to be around: affordable housing, homelessness, huge numbers of bills, huge numbers of budget programs. These issues are not going away, and they're going to be challenges for the state of California next year. Questions being for JPAC, what areas do we want to continue or focus on? 2 years ago, roughly, the governor made a huge mistake. He and the Department of Finance said, we're going to have a $50 billion deficit, and therefore we need to cut programs. And they asked the legislature to cut a lot of senior programs that are important to organizations within JPAC, like Jewish Family Services. And, we resisted and fought back, and the legislature refused to cut those programs. And then it turned out the governor was completely wrong. And that while they believed there was going to be an economic downturn, because white collar workers in California were still working during COVID from their homes, they were still making the same money. It was actually the blue collar workers that were most impacted by COVID in the workplace. And so the state revenue stayed steady and continued to increase. So there's no guarantee also the governor or the Department of Finance or the administration is going to be accurate all the time, which means JPAC has to continue to focus on Jewish values and the priorities of our member organizations. And sometimes that may be resisting rather than being proactive.
Right. That's totally right. And so, you're touching on what I think is an important way to kind of close our conversation, which is what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And you named a bunch of really key issues that are coming from the state. We're going to have to look at those and see where the energy is going to be. We're going to talk to our member organizations. We're going to work with our coalitions, and we're going to operate from the beginning as if we have resources available to us that we can access, and then continue to evolve and pivot as the circumstances require us to. Right. So we are already in the process. The legislative cycle ended on Friday, and it is Monday, and we were already in the process of thinking about bills and budget items for next year. We're talking with key member organizations. For all of you, if you want to start sharing ideas with us, now is a great time to do so. But we're keeping our ear to the ground. We're starting conversations early. And we're keeping as many options open as possible. And of course, as the year moves on, early next year, we'll have a better sense of what's available for us, and we'll pivot accordingly. I know we're at about 12:56. I want us to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. I hope that many of you who have submitted questions felt like they were heard and incorporated into our conversation. I started to see them come in, and when we ended up answering many of them. If there are more questions that you have, after this, feel free to reach out to me or Cliff or Allison, and we're happy to address them. But I will take this, I guess, this closing moment as an opportunity to mention Advocacy Day as well. We recently set our dates for Advocacy Day 2023. They will be May 9th to 10th. May 9th to 10th, 2023. We are going to send hundreds and hundreds of California's Jewish leaders up to Sacramento on these days for an amazing policy conference with a bunch of legislators. We'll hear from them, we'll learn from them, we'll interact with them, and then we'll ultimately go and lobby. It's an incredible experience for those who have experienced it before. And so please put it on your calendar, save the date for now, tell your friends, and we will have registration information out soon. I'm also going to put in the chat for all of you to see generally our contact information for folks on our team, and a link to our website. You can join our newsletter and stay up to date on all of our information by going to our website and going to the bottom and registering. Yeah, again, just as I mentioned, feel free to reach out to any of us here. And finally, I'll give you the last word, Cliff, but before I finish, I want to say thank you to Allison. Thank you to Cliff. And a really wonderful holiday season to all of you. Gemar Chatima Tova, wonderful fast later this week, and hope you all find a lot of meaning in your time of reflection. Cliff, do you want to close as well?
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, no, I want to thank Allison and you, and don't want to forget Sarah, who was a great employee of JPAC over her tenure with us. We will miss her, and Christina from my office, who left also.
Yeah.
For all our work for JPAC, and wish everyone on the call a great holiday. Feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any questions or any ideas as a result of today's webinar. Happy to chat with you or email with you if you do have questions. So thanks for participating. And I will pitch Advocacy Day also. I think it's what really enhances and makes JPAC an outstanding organization, and the perception that our members come to Sacramento and care about these issues and that the Jewish community is following them really makes JPAC effective and helps me in my work.
Yeah. Thanks, Cliff. So thanks to all of you. Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, and we will talk soon. Take care.
Thank you so much, Cliff and David.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks everyone for being here today.